what Bryan Caplan's talking about, where people hold stupid beliefs and they hold on to them doggedly, and that we don't know that we don't know. And it's an empirical matter of what matters in the world. You know? All I want to say is give some space to the idea that there are situations in which people are confronted with pure serendipity. They're off doing one thing and all of a sudden something else crops up that they didn't even think about before that. I'm not saying that it's necessarily the most important thing in the issue. I agree with 99% of what Bryan said. I disagree adamantly with what he had to say about socialism. Not because I disagree that incentives are what caused the real-world socialism to collapse. That's not the point. This is a very subtle debate. I think if we want to talk about it later, we can go in those lines of argument. But I actually think it's a very subtle issue, the nature of history of socialism in practice, and what role the calculation argument comes to bear on that. What I will say is that Bryan, I think, introduces some weasel words here. One of them was neoclassical economics correctly understood. That means neoclassical economics is understood by Bryan. And in that sense, I'm a neoclassical economist. And he also said any neoclassical economist could argue this. I think Bryan should go in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and go back in time and realize that from 1937 to 1985, the majority of economists believed that socialism could work. Theoretically, there was no argument. So you have to remember what it was like. Some of the students went with me up to Maryland recently. I work at this center up at Maryland called IRIS, the Institute for Research on the Informal Sector, and I brought a bunch of them with me. And it was the first paper in my professional career that was given where a guy actually argued socialism was better than capitalism. It was like a shock for me because that's what it was when I was an undergraduate. Bryan's too young to remember that. You know, back when I was an undergraduate, it wasn't only the moral side of arguments were on the side of socialism, but it also tended to be that, you know, they could actually outproduce us. And if you go back even further in time, you got to remember that when Nikita Khrushchev banged his shoe on the table, it wasn't militarily bury you. It was economically, we will bury you. Okay? So yeah, the world changed a lot. It moved in a different direction. So of course nowadays, and I benefited from that as an economist who thinks socialism's not, you know, is pretty shabby. You know, I benefited from that because during my whole professional career, whenever I've argued about socialism, those who are advocates of socialism were on defensive. You know, so I remember when I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the history of socialism, and I remember presenting it when I was going out in the job market. And I guarantee you in some of those rooms I was talking at, there were faculty members who were true believers, but they couldn't say it at that time, because to say it at that time would be like, you know, I'm really stupid. Here, recognize me. And so they in fact wouldn't want to say that at that time. All right, let me get back on point here. I'm not going to be as charming as Bryan. This is one of the problems of having to comment on Bryan. But one of the things I should point out, which reiterates a theme that he had, I've known about Bryan and respected Bryan's work for a long time, farther back in history than he knew me. Because when I was a graduate student, Bryan was finishing up graduate school. Bryan had written this little essay which circulated around through a guy named Sheldon Richman. That was his critique of David Friedman. And Tyler's critique of it, yeah. And it circulated around all of us, so we all had a kind of a, Bryan was sort of the great hope of the future, and then he just sort of disappointed all of us. We're all very excited about Bryan. In fact, I can remember an internet episode when email groups were first getting started. We had a little email group, and Bryan Caplan joined our email group, and I was all excited until I started reading his posts. But that's a whole other idea. As Bryan pointed out, we have a deep affinity of our interests, not only the three that he mentions, but actually the two of us have a fascination with the history and practice of real-world socialism and fascism, which is unusual among economists. Bryan, in fact, has his webpage has a museum of communism, and as far as I know, you haven't written any professional papers, maybe one review on socialism, but the knowledge that he has in the area is phenomenal. And in fact, I reference in my classes for all the students to read it, including over in Eastern Europe this summer when I had a bunch of lefty lunatic students who didn't grow up under socialism anymore, but grew up under whatever the hell we want to call it now, crony capitalism or whatever. And so they were all like gung-ho for socialism, let's try it. And one kid, in fact, tried to tell me that capitalism kills millions, socialism is the way of the future. So I pointed him to Bryan's webpage. It didn't have the same effect, by the way, that an experiment had, though. We ran the experiments in class. We did a public goods experiment where you're supposed to cooperate to get the public good, and everyone cheats, you know? And the kid screamed out in the middle of the thing that he lost his faith in humanity. But it wasn't from Bryan's website, it was from the experiment. So I actually fully endorse the experiments now. One of the things you have to recognize about Bryan is that Bryan is probably among the most thoroughly read critics of Austrian economics in the history of the Austrian school. Most people who are critics of the Austrian school, they can legitimately criticize it. No one says that they can't, but they usually do it from a position of ignorance, not knowing what they had to say. But Bryan is thoroughly read in it, and actually George Mason probably has a unique club of these types of people. Tyler Cowen is another one, Bryan, and maybe you might throw Alex in there as well. And that's one of the reasons why it's a very interesting place to be as someone who is interested in these ideas. The problem that I've had historically with Bryan's arguments against Austrianism has little to do, in some sense, with what he argued today. My fundamental criticism comes from the idea that Bryan follows a kind of a logical argument which says the following thing. Austrian economics equals Mises. Rothbard equals Mises. If I can show that Rothbard is wrong, therefore Mises must be wrong, therefore Austrian economics must be wrong. I deny several links in that argument. One of the reasons is Austrian economics has a genealogy which is much broader than that. And that's one of the things I'm always trying to say. Bryan says it's a sky is blue kind of thing. That might be true, but one of the ways in which you judge a school of thought is what kind of directions of research it spawns, right? In fact, a school of thought, to be successful, should destroy itself, right? Let's not, get caught up in any of these silly ideas that we're going to have 5 guys in a room, be totally pure, and that's going to be an effective way to do things. If we actually won the day, we'd be teaching at Harvard. Hi, Andre, how you doing? I'm hanging out with you today. Right? We would take over the economics profession, be the editor of the American Economic Review. And so one of the things that you have to look at in the history of a school of thought is actually the kind of ideas in which it's generated and the kind of work that it's gone, because it's gone in different directions. And in this regard, you can slice the view of Austrian economics through like Morgenstern. You can do all these things like that. So the Austrian school is extremely vibrant in a way that I would suggest many other schools haven't been in terms of the directions in which it's pushed people in. All right? So I think that's one of the things that I think Bryan reads the narrow. It's sort of like reads Murray Rothbard's, like, the back cover of Rothbard's book, or Hans Hoppe's book, and says, all right, that's good. Now, one of the problems with Bryan, which makes him very unique, which is one of the reasons for the disappointment earlier, is that when I was growing up in Austrian economics, everyone knew that these guys like Ludwig Lachmann and Israel Kirzner were more sophisticated and more academically successful